The lawyer's voice was steady, almost detached, as he read from the yellowed paper. To my niece, Marissa Clark, I leave the house on Willow Bend Road, its land and all of its contents. It is my wish that she care for it as I once did. However, he cleared his throat, eyes flicking toward her before continuing. One possession is of particular importance. The doll. It must never be sold, never destroyed, and if possible, it should remain secured as it has always been. Do your best to keep it locked away. Marissa blinked, sitting stiffly in the leather chair of the lawyer's office. She wanted to interrupt, to laugh, to demand an explanation, but the man's expression was unreadable, and the words on the page were plain enough. A doll. Not jewelry, not stocks or savings. A doll. By the time she signed the paperwork and slid the pen back across the desk, the thought of it lingered like a splinter under her skin. The drive to Willow Bend Road stretched on longer than she remembered. The countryside unrolled around her, vast and indifferent, fields of dead grass bending in the late autumn wind. Thin stands of leafless trees rattled as she passed, their branches clawing against a gray sky that looked like it had been drained of all color. When she finally turned down the gravel lane, her grandmother's house appeared in the distance. It rose at the end of the property like a relic from another age, its silhouette sharp and severe against the clouds. A three-story Victorian, its steep gables and tall narrow windows gave it the air of a house that watched. The paint, once white, had weathered into a sickly gray, and ivy clung stubbornly to the east wall like veins across old skin. The yard was vast but neglected. The grass reached high in patches, the fencing leaned with age, and rusted farm equipment sat abandoned near a half-collapsed barn. The place carried a weight, as though every nail and brick remembered the lives that had passed through its halls. Marissa parked near the front steps and killed the engine. The silence was immediate, oppressive. No birdsong, no wind, just the faint ticking of the car as it cooled. She stared up at the windows, dark panes reflecting the clouds above, and a shiver ran down her spine. Somewhere in the back of her mind, her aunt's words from the will replayed themselves. Do your best to keep it locked up. The steps up to the porch groaned beneath her weight, the wood soft with years of weather. The front door stood tall and heavy, its paint cracked in spiderweb patterns around the brass handle. Marissa hesitated before pushing it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and the smell of the house rolled out to meet her. Cedar, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like wilted flowers left too long in a vase. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that feels aware. Dust motes floated in pale shafts of light that pierced through lace curtains. White sheets draped the furniture like shrouds, each chair and sofa transformed into a ghostly outline. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, its hands frozen at 3:30. Marissa's footsteps echoed too loudly as she moved from room to room. Every wall bore faded wallpaper, curling in corners where dampness had gotten in. Family photographs hung crooked in tarnished frames, their subjects long gone, faces washed out by time. Then she stepped into the sitting room. There, against the far wall, an armchair had been left uncovered, and in it, sitting upright as though it had been waiting for her, was the doll. Its porcelain skin was flawless, almost luminous in the dim light. The pale blue dress was trimmed with lace, as crisp and clean as if it had just been pressed. Golden curls framed its face, each one too precise, too real. But the eyes, glass, clear and unblinking, seemed to hold her in place. No matter where she shifted, those eyes tracked her. A chill rippled through her chest. She crouched slightly, leaning closer, though every instinct screamed to stay back. The craftsmanship was startling, unsettling in its perfection. Tiny lashes framed those sharp eyes, and its lips, painted a soft rose, seemed caught in the hint of a pout. The words from the will returned to her, echoing in her mind. Never sold, never destroyed, locked away. Marissa stood abruptly, brushing the dust from her jeans and back toward the door. She muttered to herself, trying to force a laugh. Just a doll. Just a stupid doll. But as she turned away, she swore she heard the faintest creak of fabric, like something shifting in its chair. By the time she finished unpacking a few essentials upstairs, night had settled over the countryside. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and the old house seemed to creak and groan as though it were settling around her presence. Marissa shut her bedroom door firmly, turning the lock with more force than necessary, then sat on the edge of the bed. Her eyes kept drifting to the hallway, to the shadows stretching long and uneven under the flicker of the single lamp. She told herself the doll was still in the sitting room, untouched, forgotten, and that was where it would stay. Yet the will's words pressed against her thoughts like a weight she couldn't shake. Never destroyed. Keep it locked away. Eventually, exhaustion dragged her down. She slipped beneath the covers, staring up at the ceiling until her eyes grew heavy. The steady tick of the grandfather clock echoed faintly through the walls, each chime a reminder of how alone she was in the house. Sometime later, she woke suddenly, heart pounding, though she didn't know why. The room was dark, her lamp long since turned off. She held her breath. From downstairs came the sound, soft, deliberate, the faint click of a latch being undone. A door opening. Her chest tightened. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, straining to listen. The sound came again, the creak of floorboards, one step then another, as though someone or something was moving slowly through the house. Marissa's mouth went dry. She told herself it was just the old place shifting, the wood contracting in the cold, the usual sounds of a house left empty for too long. But still she sat rigid in bed, her ears burning from how hard she was listening, her breath caught in her throat. The sounds stopped. Minutes ticked by, though each one felt longer than the last. The silence pressed down again, absolute. Finally, fatigue crept back in, and her body betrayed her, dragging her into uneasy sleep. And though she didn't dream, her last thought before drifting off was of those glass eyes, unblinking, fixed forever in her direction. The next few days were consumed by dust and clutter. Marissa worked room by room, pulling down yellowed curtains, stacking boxes, and sweeping floors that hadn't been touched in years. The house had its own rhythm. Every sweep of her broom or scrape of a box across the floor seemed to echo too long, like the place resented being disturbed. By the second day, she found herself speaking aloud just to cut through the silence. A muttered comment here, a half-formed joke there, though she never dared aim the words toward the sitting room where the doll remained in its chair. She avoided it without meaning to, cleaning every other part of the house first. On the third afternoon, as she hauled a load of old linens down the stairs, a knock sounded at the front door. Two women stood on the porch, wrapped against the brisk autumn air. Their smiles carried a warmth that felt strangely out of place here. They introduced themselves as Anne and Margaret, longtime friends of her aunt. "We thought we'd check in," Anne said, her voice gentle. "Your aunt would have wanted someone to make sure you were settling in all right." They stayed for tea in the kitchen, their chatter filling the house with a life it hadn't known in years. They spoke fondly of Eleanor, about how she had always kept her house in meticulous order, how she'd hosted them for quiet evenings filled with stories and cards. But as the visit stretched on, the tone shifted. "Have you come across it yet?" Margaret asked at last, eyes narrowing slightly. Marissa frowned. It? Anne leaned forward, her smile gone. The doll. She always said it had to be kept locked away. She wouldn't even let us look at it for long. Said it wasn't meant for us. Marissa tried to laugh, though it came out strained. Yeah, the will mentioned it. Weird, right? It's just porcelain. The two women exchanged a glance. Margaret's voice was quiet when she spoke. Don't take it lightly. There are stories. Your aunt never explained them, but she was adamant. That thing watches. And sometimes it waits. The warning lingered as they gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Anne squeezed Marissa's hand before stepping outside. Just do as she did. Keep it locked up. Marissa waved them off, forcing a smile. But the silence that followed their departure seemed heavier than before. She climbed the stairs to continue her cleaning and froze halfway up. The doll. It sat on the landing, hands folded neatly in its lap, head tilted just slightly. Its glass eyes were angled toward the front door, as though it had been watching the entire conversation. Her stomach flipped. She was certain, absolutely certain, it had been left in the sitting room yesterday. But hadn't she moved it herself at some point? Maybe she'd set it down here in passing and forgotten. That had to be it. She was tired, overwhelmed. It was easy to misremember small things. Forcing a shaky laugh, she picked it up. The porcelain was cold against her skin, colder than the air. She carried it through the upstairs hall until she found the cabinet in the far corner of her aunt's old sewing room. Heavy oak, glass-paned doors, and a small brass key left dangling in the lock. She opened it, placed the doll inside, and shut the door with more force than she meant to. The glass rattled faintly as she turned the key. There, she muttered, brushing her hands together. Exactly where it belongs. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes followed her, even through the glass. Marissa woke in the middle of the night, the room thick with silence. At first, she thought it was nothing, the usual groan of an old house shifting against the cold. But then she heard it, soft, deliberate. Footsteps. They came faintly from the hallway outside her room, slow, one after another. Her heart raced as she pushed herself up onto her elbows, ears straining. She held her breath, listening harder, waiting for the next step. Nothing. The silence pressed down again, heavy and complete. She sat there for what felt like minutes, her pulse thundering in her ears before finally lying back. The fog of sleep crept in and pulled her under once more. When morning came, she pushed the bedroom door open and froze. The house was still, the air faintly colder, as though it had been disturbed during the night. She padded down the stairs, bare feet brushing the worn carpet, and entered the parlor. Her stomach dropped. The doll was back in the armchair. Perfectly upright, hands folded neatly in its lap, glass eyes catching the pale morning light. Exactly where she'd first found it. For a long moment, she simply stood there, frozen in the doorway. She knew she had locked it in the sewing room cabinet the night before. She had turned the key, shut the glass, walked away. Her chest tightened. Maybe I forgot, she whispered, though her voice shook. Maybe I didn't actually lock it. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. She remembered the weight of the oak cabinet, the squeak of the hinges, the sound of the brass key turning in the lock. She remembered all of it. And still, here the doll sat, watching. The rest of that morning passed in a fog. Marissa tried to distract herself with chores, but her eyes kept straying back to the parlor. Every time she walked by, the doll sat motionless in the armchair, staring ahead with glassy calm. She told herself she would put it back in the cabinet that night, that maybe she'd just been careless. But the thought gnawed at her until she gave up, carried it upstairs, and shut it away again. The key clicked in the lock. That night, she set the key on her nightstand and stared at it for a long time before finally slipping into uneasy sleep. She woke again to the sound. Not a door this time, not the house creaking, but something softer, closer, like fabric brushing against the hallway wall just beyond her door. Her skin prickled. She sat up slowly, straining to listen. The sound faded into silence. After several minutes, she convinced herself it was her imagination. Sleep took her again. In the morning, when she descended the stairs, she froze at the bottom step. The doll was there, sitting primly on the rug in the entryway, facing the front door as though waiting for someone to arrive. Over the next few days, the disturbances multiplied. She would wake to faint giggles that vanished the moment she sat upright. Mirrors seemed to ripple faintly in her peripheral vision. Objects she was sure she'd left in one place ended up somewhere else. Keys on the counter instead of the hook. A mug set down in the kitchen reappearing in the hallway. Each night she locked the doll away. Each morning it was somewhere new. Sometimes in the parlor, sometimes on the landing. Once even on the chair by her bed, its face turned just slightly toward her pillow. Her nerves frayed. She stopped sleeping properly, jolting awake at the faintest sound. Her days blurred together, fueled by stale coffee and raw anxiety. She began avoiding mirrors, avoiding the parlor, avoiding the truth building in the pit of her stomach. One evening, as she passed the cabinet where the doll should have been, she noticed the lock undone. The glass door hung open just an inch. The key was still in her nightstand drawer upstairs. Her hand trembled as she pushed the cabinet shut again. "This house is getting to me," she whispered. "That's all. Just the house." But when she turned, she swore she saw the faintest shadow shift across the hallway floor, moving where nothing should have moved at all. By the end of the week, Marissa was unraveling. The sleepless nights, the sounds in the hall, the shifting of objects she swore she hadn't touched, it all built like static in her skull. But the worst was the mirror. She was brushing her teeth in the upstairs bathroom when, just for a heartbeat, her reflection wasn't her. The face in the glass was smooth, porcelain pale, lips painted in a rose pout. Glass eyes stared back at her unblinking. She dropped the toothbrush, her stomach flipping, and when she looked again, it was just her own face. That night, the doll wasn't in the cabinet. It wasn't in the parlor. It was sitting at the desk in her aunt's sewing room, hands folded neatly atop an open journal, as though it had been waiting for her. She slammed the journal shut, scooped up the doll with shaking hands, and shoved it back into the cabinet. She twisted the key, turned it twice, and left the room without looking back. But when she returned hours later, the door was wide open again. The next night broke her. Marissa woke gasping, sure she'd heard footsteps circling her bed. She flicked on the lamp, heart pounding. The room was empty, the door was shut. But the doll was there, sitting on the dresser. She stared at it, frozen, until her breath slowed. She whispered to herself, over and over, "It's not real. It's not real." Yet the longer she stared, the more certain she became that its head was tilted differently than before, just slightly angled toward her. She snatched it up, marched downstairs, and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames roared, but instead of catching, the doll sat untouched in the embers, its glass eyes glinting in the firelight. Her chest seized with terror. She stumbled back, her legs weak. When the flames died down, the doll remained seated perfectly in the hearth, porcelain unmarked, curls intact. Something whispered then, a faint voice, childlike, curling through the room. "Don't leave me." Marissa bolted up the stairs, slammed her bedroom door, and pressed her back against it, trembling. When she dared look across the room, the doll was sitting on her pillow. Marissa hadn't slept in days. The house had become a maze of whispers and shifting shadows, every room tainted by the doll's presence. She would catch glimpses of porcelain skin in mirrors, hear faint giggles in the walls, feel cold eyes fixed on her even when she was alone. It was wearing her down, hollowing her out. That night, as she sat trembling on the edge of her bed, she felt it, a weight pressing against her chest, not physical, but suffocating all the same. Her thoughts tangled, her body sluggish, as though her very self was being pulled somewhere else. In the corner of her vision, the doll stood, not sitting, not placed, standing. Its head tilted, glass eyes gleaming, her breath hitched. The room blurred at the edges. She clutched her temples, certain she was about to slip, about to lose herself. And then a sharp knock rattled the front door. She stumbled downstairs, every step unsteady, and opened it to find a man in his 70s, thin but solid, with a caretaker's posture and wary eyes. "Name's Harold," he said, removing his cap. "I looked after this property for your aunt. When I heard she passed, I figured I'd best come check, before it was too late." Marissa stared at him, wild-eyed, trembling. "It's already too late," she whispered. "It's loose." His gaze hardened. Without another word, he brushed past her and strode into the house with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was dealing with. He went straight to the parlor. The doll was waiting there in the armchair. Harold pulled a worn chain from his coat pocket, a small brass key dangling from it, and shook his head. "You've been locking it wrong, girl. Wrong place entirely." Marissa's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "I used the cabinet upstairs, the sewing room." "Not that one." His voice was sharp, heavy with certainty. "That's just furniture." "The case is in the study, a different room altogether. Eleanor knew. She always knew. It's the only thing that'll hold it." He led her into the study, where a tall, glass-fronted case stood against the far wall. The wood was darker, heavier than the cabinet she'd been using, and strange symbols were carved faintly into its frame. They looked like scratches, but arranged with purpose. Harold unlocked it with the brass key and gestured for her to bring the doll. Marissa's hands shook violently as she lifted it. The porcelain was colder than ice, almost humming with a pulse that wasn't hers. She placed it inside the case, and Harold shut the door, turning the key with a decisive click. The air in the room seemed to lighten instantly, as though a pressure she hadn't realized was crushing her had finally eased. Her lungs filled fully for the first time in days. Harold fixed her with a hard look. "You listen to me. If it's out too long, if it gets to watch you for too much time, it'll take you, piece by piece, thought by thought. You'll stop being you." Marissa swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to burn it. I tried." He cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Can't destroy it. Can't throw it out. Try and it'll come back. Always does. That's why it must stay locked. It's not a toy. It's a cage." That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, still trembling from what had nearly happened. The house was quiet now, the silence finally empty instead of watching, but her mind kept circling back to the case in the study. The doll was inside, sealed away behind glass and carvings she didn't understand. But in the darkness, She swore she could still feel it. Waiting, watching. And though the case was locked, its faint whispers still echoed in her mind. "Don't leave me." Weeks passed, and the house no longer felt like it was pressing against her lungs. Marissa found herself able to sleep again, though never deeply. She kept to her routines, sweeping floors, opening curtains, even tending to the neglected garden. The silence of the house felt less suffocating, more like a companion she could learn to live with. For a while she let herself believe the worst had ended, until the night she woke and found the study door ajar. Her blood went cold as she crept inside, and there it was, the cabinet wide open, its lock dangling uselessly. The doll sat neatly on the desk, glass eyes fixed on her with that same unblinking patience. But this time she didn't scream. She didn't stumble back in terror. Her hands still trembled, but her fear carried something else with it now. Resolve. She picked it up firmly, carried it back to the case, and locked it inside with the brass key. She whispered through clenched teeth, "You don't get to win." The air lightened again, the pressure fading, but she knew now what Harold had warned her about. No matter what, the doll would always find a way. Still, Marissa carried herself differently afterward. Each time it escaped, and it did once or twice more, she locked it away again, more confident, more practiced. The whispers still curled at the edge of her thoughts, the sense of being watched never fully gone. But she no longer felt helpless. Life went on. She read in the mornings by the parlor window, drank tea on the porch, and even laughed sometimes. The doll was always there, waiting in its glass prison, but now it was a burden she carried with grim certainty instead of panic. Marissa had survived its gaze once. She knew it would try again, and when it did, she would be ready. Still, on quiet nights when the wind died down and the house held its breath, she could swear she heard its faint whisper echo through the halls. "Don't leave me." And that concludes tonight's tale, an eerie connection to the doll that watches, a chilling reminder that some things can never truly be destroyed, only contained. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Campfire Horror Stories, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the next nightmare. Your comments and shares help keep this channel alive, and I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your cabinets sealed, and never ignore the feeling of eyes watching you in the dark. Sleep well, if you can.